What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Policy Plug. This is the space where we humanize the people who influence policy and bring the policy to the people. So listen, we've been on this journey for a little bit, and I first want to thank you all for being here this long. This is a sign that maybe you're interested in it, and I hope that we've been giving you the tools, the things that you need to engage positively in how you take ownership in democracy, take ownership in how you change your life through public policy. Public policy, and the reason we usually start at this is because it can often feel overwhelming and inaccessible. Feels like I need to have a PhD in order to understand how I can pull up at the ballot box and vote in efficient ways. And so we established this to be able to help erode that gap. And I can think of no more inaccessible space, unfortunately, than national security and international affairs policy, especially in Black and brown communities. It's been a sense of feeling like a luxury because we're trying to just make it through the day, make it through the week, try to make sure that we get the kitchen table, the economics of it all figured out. And so we wanted to make sure that today we had a discussion on a issue that I love, that I work in, and that one of my guests work in. So with that, I want us to welcome my guest. So pleased to have her on here, the Nola Haynes. Y'all, let's clap it up for Nola. Hey. How you doing, friend?
I'm good, friend. I like the. Can we do that?
The like THEEE and then yeah.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This is definitely a treat. I'm happy to be here.
Absolutely. We met on Clubhouse. And you were actually one of the ones that was there in the very beginning when the Policy Plug was something that first lived on Clubhouse. And so, you know, as we were establishing this, it was absolutely necessary. So we got to bring this full circle and bring you in and bring you around. We had countless conversations on a myriad of topics, but especially national security. Yeah.
Absolutely. And our friend Bert, he always says that he got seasoned in those Clubhouse days, those early Clubhouse days. I mean, we would spend hours upon hours just talking about policy topics and security. And I didn't think about it until I was getting ready to come here today. I was like, Bert is absolutely right. We really sharpened our skill sets on that platform. We absolutely did.
It taught you how to communicate better, communicate more effectively, figure out and navigate things. Yeah. So, I mean, look, welcome to the new and improved
I love it. It sounds
Policy
sexy.
Plug.
Look how sexy this place is.
Look,
I love it.
We was going for that.
That's intentional. No, I love it. This is great. And I think that, it's a larger metaphor. Like I actually find our work to be quite sexy, but it also has a very serious nature in how it impacts people's lives. And I guess at some point I should introduce myself as to why I'm even, privileged enough to sit here and have this conversation.
Yeah.
Should I do that?
So let the people know, the Policy Plug family know who is Nola Sorry, this is gonna be a thing now. Who is the Nola Haynes.
Okay, I'm gonna change all my credit cards. I'm gonna take the doctor off and put the So my name is Dr. Nola Haynes, and I am.
Ooh, doctor, it's official.
It is official, Dr. Nola Haynes. I'm an academic, so I work in the theoretical space, and then I like to say that I also work in the applied space. And for me, when I first applied to PhD programs buku years ago at this point, it was important for me to make that clear, that I think theory is important, it's foundational, but I wanted to apply this knowledge in the real world. So I have the amazing privilege of being an academic, working at Georgetown University, and then also being able to apply that knowledge as an appointee on the International Security Advisory Board at the Department of State. And also my other 500 billion affiliations from the Center of New American Security to Truman to being an affiliate at the National Security Center at Virginia, the University of Virginia. I'm just, I think about this all the time, and I talk to my daddy about it all the time. I'm like, Daddy, did you see this for me? Because I don't know if I saw this for me. Like,
Right.
I just wanted to be a ballerina.
Right. Right.
That's all I wanted to do.
And now you're on a global stage and thinking about global things.
Man, it's such a privilege. And when I use that word privilege, I'm not speaking in terms of the space in and of itself being privileged, as we
Right.
know it is. When I say privilege, I mean to be able to be in these rooms, in these spaces, to be able to then go out and be an educator, to educate not just my students in my classroom,
Right.
but, through media or just through everyday conversations about what this large thing of foreign policy, international affairs, and national security mean.
Yeah. So, Nola, Haynes, does that have any connection with anywhere geographically? I'm going to tease it out. Anywhere geographically.
I mean, half lip. I am from the best city in the country, but anyhow.
Oh.
Yes, born and raised in New Orleans, Louisiana. Very proud of that. And, I was on a podcast earlier today, and I was asked, where did this interest come from? And it actually started in New Orleans, not just because we are a melting pot. We're a hodgepodge of all different cultures and ethnicities. But, the school that I went to, it was a ton of little Irish women teaching us, these little Irish nuns teaching these little black kids, honey, about different things about the world, different languages and stuff like that. And I just remember this one moment when I was in the 5th grade. Sister Magella, who was like one of my favorite teachers.
Sister who?
Magella.
Magella, okay.
She had this poster on the wall of Oxford, and I would stare at it. And so one day I had asked her, I was like, where is that? And she was like, if anybody can get there, you can. And to hear that as a black child in the 5th grade, not just from your mom and daddy, because they're going to pump you up anyway.
Right, right.
But to hear that, from your teachers early on is just so important, which is one of the reasons why I am an educator. I know how important that role is. So the world, I had always been curious about the world since I was a little girl.
Okay.
And talking about coming full circle, like the policy plug, definitely I feel like I'm in a moment of full circleness. Is that a word? I don't know if
we'll make it one. Listen,
right?
we'll lobby for it to be in Merriam-Webster's newest version.
Okay. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. So one of the things that we do, try to do here at the Policy Plug, we humanize the people who influence policy.
Yeah.
And again, our main point is that everybody has an ability to influence policy, but you are already headlong right in that. So let's take the 30,000 foot drop. Let's go right back to the beginning.
Okay.
Your favorite TV show? I usually ask the movie, but favorite TV show of all time. It can be
of all time.
Of all time. I know I'm put you. You got to commit. Got to commit to one.
I got to commit to one. Okay, I'll
give you 2. Go ahead.
Okay, I will say the first thing that popped into my mind was A Different World.
Oh, okay.
Because growing up in a black environment like New Orleans, growing up on Xavier's campus because my daddy worked there, that Different World spoke to me, as a kid. Like, I just couldn't wait to get to Xavier. Like, oh my God, all these black people, it's gonna be so much fun. I didn't get to Xavier, but anyway, that's another story. Shout out to UCLA. But that was a foundational show in my life. And, now it's really hard to say. I can't commit to a second show because literally love British detective shows. You know that. Like, I'm obsessed. I watch them all the time.
I do too.
Like, Midsummer Murders is always on repeat. But anyhow, that's okay. Yeah.
So it has the status of like Matlock. And if it shows up late at night in this.
Matlock.
Look. So who was your favorite character then on A Different World? Was it, because I'm going to go out on a limb and say, what were your thoughts on Whitley?
First of all, since everybody tends to think I am Whitley, I don't know why. But, I'm not going to lie. Like, I would be glued to that TV just waiting for Denise to come back. I'm like, she got to come back. She got to come back. Like, I convinced myself that Denise Huxtable was going to come back. But it was something about her character that really resonated with me, like her kind of bohemian curiosity. And so definitely Denise was my favorite. But after she left, I would have to actually say it was Dwayne Wade because my dad was an engineer.
Okay.
And so, did I say Dwayne Wade?
You
I meant
did.
to say
You
Dwayne
meant-
Wayne.
yes.
My bad.
I caught you with the flip up, sunglasses.
Yeah, I liked his character a whole lot. Yeah.
Okay. As an academician, what's the last book you read?
What's the last book?
The last book you read. For fun. Don't give us.
Oh,
don't give
okay.
us. Look. Don't give us the. Don't give us the classified documents that you've been reading.
Actually, I have this kind of self-pilgrimage that I do. And what I mean by that is I saw recently that Billy Porter's going to be playing James Baldwin, who in my mind is my imaginary uncle.
I did not know that he was going to be doing that. Okay.
Yeah. And I yearly revisit his canon. And I think I read Fire Next Time at least twice a year. It's just something that calls me in a way that I can't really speak to. You know, this book, this letter was about James Baldwin writing to his nephew.
Right.
But something about it just resonates with me. I don't know if it's the prophetic nature of it all, the way that he understood Blackness, the way that he, left the country, spent some time outside of the country, the way that he was a witness to everything historically important to the Black community.
Yeah.
And he lived for quite some time to report it all out while his friends were being murdered and assassinated around him, right?
Yep.
So he's such a profound character in my life. And Fire Next Time is his authentic voice. It's not a fiction like his other works.
Yep.
And so Fire Next Time, I read that recently. It was his birthday, I do believe. And I also sat down and I reread a bunch of Martin Luther King's speeches.
Okay. James Baldwin's one of my favorite thought leaders. I'm a whole thought leader, but James Baldwin, he definitely is the complexity for me, the deep complexity of what he was dealing with. And he went away to Europe. Like few people know even him, Martin Luther King, some of these activists and these writers needed to get away in an international context, sometimes to get out of the work or out of the pressure cooker.
Absolutely.
So you are, and absolutely in the telling of kind of who you are, you've got quite a number of accomplishments. I mean, got the doctorate degree, specifically the doctorate degree is in?
Political science and international relations.
International relations, on MSNBC, on Al Jazeera, you was on the Black News Channel, but I think part of the catch with people who have seen you on these platforms is, here's a Black person and a Black lady talking about international affairs. Sometimes I feel like in the Black community, we get typecast.
Yes.
In different issues, including in social justice issues. And so, sometimes you see a Black face and you're like, oh, they're about to talk about poverty alleviation. But here you come talking about nuclear deterrence and, talking about disinformation and misinformation, talking about Ukraine in the context in China and these things. Just kind of speak towards how you got there. Because I think people can often see the outcome, but they don't often get to appreciate the process.
Right. So what probably I haven't shared before, and you would be the person to extract this information. A lot of what I do is actually from my lived Black experience and from the people that inspired my thinking, from both of my parents being in the military. My father doing 2 tours in Vietnam in the Air Force and, him coming home, speaking a little Vietnamese, bringing home, some Vietnamese dishes, that he would cook. Like, obviously, I came along after the war was done, but I just thought it was normal to have eggs in like all of your meals. Like, I just really thought it was normal, But, that's something that my dad learned in Vietnam. So that early curiosity and also going back to my dad, just thinking about he still has a very global outlook. Like, this is a very true story. There were like 2 books on our bookshelf. It was K-Fear Boy,
Okay.
Stephen Biko,
Yep.
and Mein Kampf. And as a child,
Two
so this
heavy
is what I'm
things.
reading as a child.
Yeah, no, those are not light reads.
And I got to compare the 2 and like come up with some deep analysis of why they are both different, so yeah. Thank you, Ernest Paul. But, but the point being is that I've always had this curiosity with injustice, not just domestically, but also, outside of our U.S. context. And so reading things like that early on, reading about the ugliness and, of the Holocaust and what that word fascism means and how nationalism, factors into that, how religion gets manipulated, to juxtaposing that with a story of someone like Stephen Biko, right? And then the early thought leaders, like W.E. Du Bois, right? Like,
Yep.
he pieced out. He said, "I'm going to Ghana. Like, I can't deal with y'all." Thinking about Ralph Bunche, who's
Right.
a huge another imaginary uncle of mine. And then the women, Toni Morrison. Toni Morrison is such an influence. Beloved and Tar Baby. Those 2 stick out in my mind for very different reasons. But Tar Baby, because she takes it outside of the U.S. context.
Right.
And she talks about colonialism, right? And the impacts that it had on Black people outside of the U.S. context, right? So I found that to be fascinating. I often wish, my imaginary aunt, Lorraine Hainsbury, I wish she would have lived. I would have loved to see more plays and more of her work, because I think she had such a unique perspective about Blackness. And so very early on, it was the thought leaders of Renaissance. It was the civil rights leaders.
Okay.
And my dad is, came after the kind of the Southern leadership, and he was definitely more of a SNCC guy. So he's hardcore Rap Brown, Stokely Carmichael. I mean Touré. My bad. So it's that kind of thinking, and then my mama follows it up with music. So it was like all of these different kind of intellectual experiences and what's the word I'm looking for? These things that kind of like become part of your DNA. And then my mom would listen to everything, And so it was all of these different things in the gumbo pot, right?
Yeah, Linda Thomas. Great.
Exactly,
Yeah,
gumbo
Linda Thomas,
diplomacy,
yeah,
baby.
gumbo.
Yep. It was all of these things stirring around in a gumbo pot. And then being from New Orleans, again, there's so many different influences. And I think people tend to only think about the African and the French influence. It's Spanish, it's German, it's a lot of different things. Haitian, right? So when you come from a place where people, you can still hear the influence of French language.
Yeah.
A lot of the elders still speak a Pig Latin version or patois. I hesitate to use patois because not in a traditional sense of like when you think about Haiti or other Caribbean folks, but it's a unique language, right? You have the Native American experience there, right?
Right.
Which is also, you can't have a pot of gumbo without sassafras, which is an herb, which is a ground root that Native Americans cultivated. Like, you just can't have a successful pot of gumbo without it. I'm going to stand 10 toes down on it.
She said, fight me on this one.
Exactly.
I'm here.
So, it's all of these different experiences that gave me the privilege as a child to dream beyond. To think beyond my immediate situation or my immediate circumstances, which some Black folks may push back on that and say, you know what? Structure is a privilege. I heard that very recently. And I've been thinking about that because it just struck me. And
I'm going to have to sit on that for a little bit.
it was.
Okay.
I've been thinking about that since I've heard it. But the point being, I completely understand that if you're worried about where your next meal is going to come from, you're
Right.
not necessarily too concerned about what just happened in Sudan.
Right.
Right. Understandably so.
Yep.
Right. And so I get that. And I think that's the challenge we both face.
Yep.
And so that's something I think a great deal about.
Gotcha. To that point, before we get into like the deep dive of the national security that I'm excited to get into, we've had, and you and I have talked about this. We talked about it even when the Policy Plug was on Clubhouse. Oftentimes, Black people's patriotism is brought into question. And I just personally believe that it should never be brought into question when we bring in context that, like, the Red Summer, 1919, when you had a whole generation of veterans, Black veterans. I mean, even if we go before then, Black folks fought for our liberation in the Civil War. But then to turn around and in, these World War I, and to come back to a space that was championing you abroad for the work that you were doing there to fight against tyranny and oppression, but then to come back in a system of oppression, and yet still hundreds of thousands of Black men signing up to be in the military, regardless of how they've been treated. That was 1919, right? But then when we look at Colin Powell, Susan Rice, Condoleezza Rice, Linda Thomas, when we look at Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, the first Black person that we've had
Under
as a Secretary of Defense, Bonnie Jenkins, right? And the Secretary of State, Ambassador Abercrombie Winstanley, right? We have this rich, not just history, we have the receipts of Black folks being in national security, in international affairs, leading in diplomacy, and yet, just to what you brought up, there is often this disconnect because it is and has been viewed as this somewhat privileged thing that if I have and only if and when all of my socioeconomic needs and kitchen table needs are met, then I can think about these things. I'm a practitioner in national security. You're a practitioner. What have you thought? We're in this space, but what case would you make to other Black people on why they belong in this space? National security, international affairs, because even business people, they belong in international affairs, right? There's a lot of money. There's a lot of coin. Hashtag get your coin. There's a lot of coin to be had, right, in these global streets, right, shall we say. So what case do you make?
As Deloitte Towers over
Sit
in the background. I'll take the last bit first, in that we were chatting a little bit about the NATO WMD conference that was held yesterday in partnership with the State Department and the Bunch International Affairs Center at Howard. And what I loved about it was when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility in any space, in any professional space, it's usually by a person of color. It's usually by a Black person, because that's just kind of part and parcel of, that's just what you are tasked to do.
Right.
What I liked about this was people were finally starting to understand that in this new world that we face, with a myriad of geopolitical problems, you need diversity of thought and ideas at the table. The post-World War II Cold War construct is no longer useful in many ways. A lot of people forget that Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014. And so this most recent invasion, Crimea, this most recent invasion really kind of changed everything, in that if Crimea wasn't the moment in which we realized rebalancing was happening, or some sort of global realignment was happening, this recent invasion of Ukraine, which was less clandestine than the Crimea in 2014 has shown the world, right, that we are definitely in a different time. And then we have China in the background, right? We have China, well, at one point who was in the background, but clearly is no longer comfortable with that position,
right,
are vying for superpower status, and they are maneuvering around the world in a very interesting way that kind of threatens a lot of our relationships and partnerships around the world, and Russia and Ukraine being the center, the center of it all. So in that, we just need everybody on deck. It's all hands on deck season. All hands on deck, right?
Get in where you fit in, everybody.
All of us need to be at the table because this is all of our problem. You know what I'm saying? This situation absolutely affects how much you are paying for your eggs at the grocery store and how much you're paying for all of your wheat products, right? Because Ukraine is the breadbasket of the world. And for all of our, vegetarian and vegan brothers and sisters out there, which are plenty, if you're wondering why your quinoa is going up,
right.
There are global supply chain issues, all types of problems that are stemming from this war. And I hate to say it, this summer, gas prices are gonna soar again.
Yeah. If you don't mind, I want to go deeper on that point, because I think that Ukraine was a flashpoint where most Black America, just to be honest, was like, that's a white country.
Yeah.
That ain't got nothing to do
White
with
people
us.
problems. Yeah.
That's white people problems, right? That's a maybe not a first world, but a second world. Ain't dealing with these third world problems. That's not my issue. But to your point, breadbasket of the world, a lot of grain. We had African immigrants. We even had very few, but some Black people that were born in Ukraine that were also refugees, and they experienced life differently as they're trying to get out. When we talk about the oil and the gas prices, and even if we stopped at the grain, we still, even in this country, have a thriving policy movement around justice for Black farmers.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And so some Black farmers here could benefit from, if you can't right now get what you need from Ukraine, there's potential opportunity. But if the mentality is, that's not my problem, we almost in some ways have been excluded and sometimes exclude out of ignorance our own selves out of those conversations and those opportunities. You and I often talk about this term racial equity as a national security imperative.
Amen.
And I know what I mean by that when I say that is like the same energy with which we pull up on national security issues and international affairs with somewhat, particularly in the national security, on this blank check feeling that there's nothing we wouldn't do to be able to fund the security of this nation. You and I know that racial equity is indeed an integral part of that, right? Because I would make the argument a nation is only as secure as its people are happy and feel welcomed. And so herein then makes that case of, to your point, why environmental justice is a national security issue. Educational equity is a national security issue, or economic equity, right? Or the ability to just exist is an economic, is a national security, right? Imperative and an issue. And so, as one who has been in it, I'm wondering what your thought is, putting your semi-professional hat on. What would you say is the state of foreign affairs from a U.S. lens, like through your lens? Where are we right now? We've heard about 2016 and Russia, right, and invading, and a lot of people are unclear about that. But that brought misinformation, disinformation. We had the war in Ukraine. We got China, who's our competitor / we don't know,
strategic competitor,
right? If it was a Facebook status, it would be #complicated, right?
Yes.
Those things.
Yes.
We have Africa, the continent, and there's a whole vibing sector of young tech talent that could be there. Like, what in your mind? What's the landscape?
Ooh, well, you pretty much just laid that thing on out there. It's definitely complicated. Relationship status complicated, right? But again, that is why all hands on deck. That is why you need to have inclusivity diverse thoughts and perspectives because of everything you just laid out, right? Because part of the problem has been the U.S. has approached a lot of this from a state of arrogance, if I'm just going to be, completely honest. And sometimes at the negotiating table, it was less negotiation and more carrot and sticking, right? So then,
like incentives versus I'm gonna beat you. That's what that stick is for. Gotcha.
Exactly.
Yep.
It's less diplomacy, and I obviously believe in diplomacy because I work where I work, and I believe in the power. I believe in soft power as we deal with hard security problems. And so what has happened, and I think Africa is such a great example of that, is we have to understand that we need partners and allies, and not to just say those words symbolically, but to actually mean it. We are in partnership with people. It's not about us going there like, well, I'm American, therefore I know all things.
Right.
That is not the case. And I think when you come from a certain perspective, when you are a person of color, when you are a Black person in this country, you tend to understand the position of a colonized people, oppressed people. So the way in which you see a security problem is going to be very different from someone who's always had structural privilege, right? It's going to be very different. The thought process, the solution-making processes are going to be very different, right?
Yeah.
Things that I care about in a security community, specifically, let's talk about disinformation, misinformation, a space that we both work in. And one of the contributions I've made in the Ukraine Russia space is to shed a light on the way in which Black folks are continuously targeted on social media through misinformation and disinformation campaigns intentionally.
Yeah.
It worked in 2015 and it continues to happen.
Yeah.
And so before the midterms, we were targeted very heavily by using Ukraine as a way to say, your eggs are expensive and you can't afford gas for your car because the U.S. is spending it all in Ukraine. That is misinformation and disinformation to the highest, right?
Right.
So a person like me can break down what a security package actually means and what it means when we talk about capabilities included in these security packages, meaning, we went to our weapon storage and we gave Ukraine a lot of stuff we already had.
Right.
Now,
and a lot of things that are not as cutting edge as the things we have.
Right, exactly. And those numbers get added to that big old number that's reported out into the media. And so it makes sense. You're listening to this number and you're like, but wait a minute.
We giving $14 billion and I can't.
Okay. Like,
look, forgive my student loans. I can already hear somebody in there. Forgive these student loans.
Come on. Okay. Hashtag. So it's things like that, being able to be in a position to look at what's going on in the communities that I care a great deal about, and to say, hey, we also need to, put our big, security hats on and figure out how to, intervene in some of these things. And so, to a question that you asked me earlier, one thing that I want to make clear about this, just like with all things, it's working for everybody. Point blank, period.
True. Very true.
So a lot of it is about calling, right? I'm putting my chaplain hat on a little bit.
Come on. We go to church here every now and then at the Policy Plug.
A lot of it is about calling.
Right.
I know that I was in Boston in grad school at the time when Boston bombings happened. And for me, that was a transformative moment, because if you were there during that time, some people brush it off because the body count wasn't as high as 9/11. And like, well, what's the big deal about, the Boston bombings? Like, not that many people died. But it was actually the aftermath of what happened. So first you had the situation where, I forget the man's name, who was blamed for the bombings, who was a dark-skinned, was he Pakistani? I forget, he was a dark-skinned man. Mm-hmm. So that's the identity piece, right? So the way in which I use identity in my national security work, that's one way.
Yep.
This darker skinned man was first blamed for the bombings. Come to find out, it was not him. It was two brothers, right?
Right.
And so the two brothers, after the bombings, shot an officer at MIT. right? I'm at Harvard at that time. I have friends at MIT, okay? If you've ever been to Cambridge, you know the close proximity in which Cambridge is, Harvard is to MIT, vice versa, and Watertown is the next town over from Cambridge, where one of the brothers was captured. Okay, that's one part of it. So the proximity element, right? And I was on campus the day when the bombings happened, meeting my Arabic felt about TA. Of course, Harvard doesn't call them TAs, teaching fellows.
Right.
And I just remember those big giant gates closing and the sirens and microphones telling us to get off campus and evacuate, people stumbling over each other to get on trains and buses. Like, this is vivid in my memory.
Right.
Like, for at least a day, I was like, this is what people in the Middle East go through every day, right? That was a real moment. And then on top of that, you had the entire city closed down, the siege. So there were different parts to it, and it impacted me in a profound way because I was at that time studying Arabic. So I was in a situation where I was around a lot of Muslim people, especially a lot of young Muslim girls. And I was doing an internship at Suffolk University at that time at the Interfaith Chaplaincy, working with young Muslim girls who were afraid to wear their hijab in public because of what you know what I mean?
The stigma,
Exactly.
the actual retaliation, physically, otherwise,
I got spit on at the bus stop because my hair was wrapped and I was carrying a big, giant Arabic book, and this white man just assumed that I was a Muslim woman. So he literally put his bodily fluids on my face. And there were witnesses and nobody did anything.
Right.
And then my roommates, I know they were looking at me side-eye like, why is this black woman learning Arabic? You know, it was just like this really interesting atmosphere.
It says, you okay?
Okay.
Right.
And so the Divinity School is unique in that I was already kind of interested in religion through a kind of politics and policy lens in the first place.
Okay.
And so you're able to do ethics and politics there. And at that time, terrorism was still talked about a great deal. So my thinking was already kind of formulating. But with all of those things taken together, I started leaning more into terrorism and identity, which then led me to illegal nuclear proliferation, which then led me to different type of threats environment and different types of arms control problems like the new hypersonic weapons race.
Right.
So all of these things connected. But I go back to that calling piece. When it's a calling, you trust the journey. Right? I've trusted the journey so far. And this is where I've ended up.
Interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
So again, everything is not for everybody.
Right.
But I would also say the same for you. You were called to do the work that you were doing.
Right.
So it's a matter of trusting that.
Right.
And then also trusting the journey. So continuing on your faith journey.
Right.
And continuing to trust.
Yeah, that's dope. I want to unpack a lot more of that disinformation, misinformation. Because one of the other things, you're actress, right? You were. And so narrative matters, it's important. The term disinformation and misinformation may feel new to people because we use it a lot now, and it's not. It almost reminds me of like prior to 9/11. It seemed like 9/11 happened, then the next day we were using the word terrorists. And what we meant by that was, Muslim people, these brown people, sometimes black people. Growing up overseas, I was especially in the United Kingdom and in England, the IRA actually was where I had heard, even as a young kid, this term terrorism. So for me, even narrative-wise, I associated that definitely not with black and brown people, but with white people fighting for a cause that they believed in, but using very, very violent methods, right? Sometimes to go about it. In that same way, disinformation and misinformation is now a buzzword. unpack for us, what's the difference? Because I feel like in too many people's minds, they're synonymous. And I think there's a slight bit of nuance of difference between what disinformation is versus misinformation.
I'm glad you brought that up because it's such a big the thing, and we've always lived with it. So it comes out of the family of propaganda. And if you are any sort of political historian in any sort of way, you'll know since the beginning of time, propaganda has been around. You know, it works to serve. Different regimes, different governments, whatever you want your message to be, right?
Yeah.
You're going to manipulate that thing in a way to be beneficial to you. That's pretty much what propaganda is, right?
Yep.
And then what happens is you get other people to buy into your messaging, and then it is then you start to hear it over and over and over, and then next thing you know, you're spouting those same talking points, right? So misinformation, disinformation is definitely within the propaganda family.
Yep.
But the differences are a little bit more insidious. So misinformation can happen easily, right? So it's almost like a game of telephone. It's like you call somebody and you tell them one thing, and by the time they call somebody else,
right,
the whole story didn't change. But it wasn't on purpose, right?
Right.
It's just the way that we hear information and distill information as human beings.
Right.
We're never going to repeat it verbatim, right? So misinformation, you can say something like, let's say something. I'm trying to think of a recent example that had something to do with Vice President Harris. Somebody said something about one of the funerals she attended, I think when she was on a continent, that she said something, but it wasn't true. What it was that it was a misrepresentation of what she said.
Okay.
And that thing blew up, right?
Okay.
It just completely took off and blew up.
Especially in these Twitter streets.
But that is the purpose. That's
right.
the purpose, right? Disinformation is intentionally basically just spreading lies. It is intentionally using a thing that could be plausible, and you are targeting a particular population that will be more amenable to that information, right? So if, say for instance, with the with certain segments of our community, again, I'll use Vice President Kamala Harris because I think that she is such a huge target when it comes to misinformation and disinformation.
Yep.
Like if you just saw a post on Instagram that said, Vice President Harris says she doesn't like black men. There's a segment of our community that will absolutely believe that thing, no sourcing.
And take it for a gospel truth. That's
and honey
right.
will run away with that. Zero sourcing, none. And they will believe that thing is gospel, right? So disinformation is insidious and intentional, but what it's meant to do is to sow chaos, to
destabilize.
To destabilize, and for you to be distrustful of whoever you're probably already conditioned to be distrustful against anyway, right? So disinformation and misinformation is more targeted, especially in the tech environment that we currently exist in, right? So where propaganda was something like, you need to get people to sign up to enlist in the Army, say for World War II, right? So you're gonna invest in this huge campaign to make soldiers look cool, to make women, to make it seem like women are gonna want you more because you're a soldier and you're fighting for Captain America, right? That's propaganda, right? Misinformation and disinformation is targeted, and it is absolutely meant to destabilize.
Yeah, we've seen disinformation when we look at Russia, 2016. To your point, let's bring some clarity. Anytime we're talking there is no evidence to suggest that Russia manipulated the ballots, that they changed voting from, one candidate to another. But what it is very clear that they did is they intentionally studied for years prior to 2016 the U.S. landscape, the demographics, the ideologies that were held within
Our pressure points.
the pressure points, and then they utilize that. That's what makes it now disinformation. They utilize that to sow doubt about the legitimacy of our voting and our elections, right? So, for instance, they would go into spaces where you have a lot of MAGA supporters and was making it seem like, oh, these black people are out there trying to change these votes and they're going to be voting twice. And you know, that's just not true. Then on the other hand, they would go overtime in black communities and very much hype up even the more the voter suppression and this feeling of not being wanted, all for the core of destabilization. Yep. When we move then now towards Ukraine, and we're seeing this disinformation in which the Russian model seems to be this one in which I'm going to tell a half-truth. I'm going to tell a part of a truth. I'm going to tell the truth that's dirty on one side, but I'm not going to tip my hand on what's happening here. And that catches, unfortunately, like wildfire. How do we get out of that? Right? Because we can't bury our head in the sand. I can even remember when the FBI had labeled certain groups, even in the United States, as black identity extremists. And just that name, that narrative was enough that some of us feared the pretext now would be Guantanamo Bay is the destination for some people that you don't like that are American citizens. So how do we grapple, right, in responsible ways, both from a government impact, but then even just the plain person reading and wading through these Twitter streets?
Oh, Twitter. That's a really good question. And it's, you know, the first thing that pops into my mind first and foremost is everyone, and I mean everyone, the first question out of your mind when you see anything, what's the source? Because not to say that you should automatically trust that source, more than there is going to be a trail of receipts. So if you are reading, say for instance, an op-ed that leads one way or the other, if it's a good op-ed, it's going to have sourcing inside of it. Although it's not like an essay or, you know, or an article per se, but if it's good information, you're going to be able to figure out where they got their information from. Right. And once you start doing that exercise on your own, you can then formulate your own thoughts and opinions once you've gathered all the details and all the facts, right? So first question should always be, what is the source? Okay. Right? Yep. And if you were this type of person, and I know that there are tons of people in our country who consider more conspiratorial sources as valid sources, I'm here to tell you, no. And we had a lot of this. I don't think it was most salient during COVID. Yeah. When you have people saying, well, I'm doing my own research. That's fine. But what's your starting point? Who are your sources? Are you just getting information inside of your own silo? Or are you actually getting research, detailed facts about, vaccines, this, that, and the third? You have to get information outside of your silo. Right. If you care about the truth, if you care about facts, you must get information outside of your silo. So are you saying in some ways that we shouldn't be scared of tension, sometimes even with our ideology, that as we're going through democracy? That's what makes a healthy democracy. I think, a lot of autocrats would disagree because they just like to give an order and thou shall be done. But in a healthy democracy, debate needs to happen. And yes, bureaucracy can be a little frustrating at times. But again, we're talking about the health of democracies, and it's needed, right? And it goes back to our earlier point about why all those voices are needed at the table and inside the room. Yeah. Because it is the cornerstone to the health of our democracy. Yeah. What role, and again, just, in part as you personally, in your personal capacity as you're thinking about it, a lot of people, because their context of disinformation and misinformation may seem new, they tend to also conflate that with it's social media. Social media is the problem, right? When
to your example, telephone was happening long before we even had Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. And in fact, gossip is as age old, and disinformation and misinformation is as age old as Babylonian captivity, right? And these different ideologies. So knowing that, to me, in my mind, social media has been an amplifier of what is already. It's not the genesis of the issue. It is the new microphone, right? The new amplifier. What sort of responsibility, if you believe that there is some, culpability, responsibility on a lot of these social media outlets, what is that, and what would ideally be ways that they go about being productive in this fight against disinformation and misinformation?
That's a good substantive question. And I want to answer it this way. Dr. Amy Ziegler at Stanford, she has a recent book about spies and intelligence. And what's very interesting about the book is, to your point that you just said, a lot of this stuff is age old. In the U.S., we're a baby country.
Right.
People forget China and Russia, we're talking about empires.
Right.
Empires.
Right.
They have been around for a minute. We are new to this game, right? So intelligence, espionage, all of these things are so old. They've been in the toolkit for a minute. Continuing with political history, Queen Elizabeth was notorious for spies, and propaganda. Notorious.
Yep. People don't know. Yeah.
So none of this is new, but like you're saying, the amplifier is new, right? It's kind of like when you think about it in historical context, comparing it to the printing press and how the printing press completely changed everything. Using another example in terms of what happened once the Bible was able to be printed and everyday people were able to read it, and it was outside of the hands of the church, right?
Right.
So it's that major shift in technology that we're talking about that has amplified a lot of these messages in a way that has been harmful. So how can a lot of these tech companies help? We were having a kind of off the camera discussion a little earlier about algorithms, right? I mean, the positive effect, how we met, how Clubhouse ushered us all into similar spaces, that had a positive effect. But I think the way in which a lot of these algorithms work in terms of, if you linger on something for a few seconds, if you mistakenly click on something, the algorithm is going to feed you that over and over and over and over again.
The echo chamber. Yeah.
Absolutely. So even if you're not radicalized, when you're just sitting up there on Twitter one night and you fall down a rabbit hole, next thing you know, your entire thinking shifts.
Right.
Right. And so I think that the way in which a lot of these algorithms kind of draw people into certain silos and keep them there, I think that is part of it, right?
Yeah.
I, again, believing firmly in democracy. I absolutely believe in freedom of speech. I absolutely believe that healthy debate is needed for a thriving democracy. But then I also believe that when people are targeted, there's a conversation that happens in the arms control community around, what triggers a war. And specifically, we're talking about cyber attacks. So if we are attacked, if there's a cyber attack, is that a sign of war?
Right.
Is that kind of like first strike?
Right.
And if you view it that way, then that must mean we must respond in kind with the second strike, right?
Yep, we call it a proportionate response.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how are we defining war, right?
Mm-hmm.
And depending on how you view that, especially when we're talking about cyber, especially when we're talking about AI technology and algorithms and all these different things, it depends on the perspective of decision makers, right? And then not wanting to infringe on the rights of the tech companies, first of all, because they employ a lot of people. And I don't know if a lot of people understand this about how the American economy works. People that employ people have a lot of rights in this country, point blank, period.
That's right.
And so a lot of the tech companies employ people. So it's a delicate balance, as you know, with your experience in the Senate. It's a delicate balance when we're talking about legislation and policy, right? But I do think a lot of the responsibility is on the tech companies in how the algorithm selects a certain group of people to be in a silo that you can see is leading to a very dark and unhealthy place. Right. Now, is that infringing on someone's First Amendment rights? Because you can see that. Do you then intervene? Right. Are we getting into Privacy Act issues? So it's a complicated situation. But I think from my own personal experience is when you're on social media, and I think something in our brain makes us think we are getting all the information from all different walks of life. That's not how that works.
Yep.
You are getting specific information depending on your likes and interests.
Yeah.
You're not hearing from across the different parts of the social media world. That's just not how it works. So it's something about this siloing that I see an opportunity.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily have a policy prescription for it, but I see an opportunity in this kind of siloing that happens.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I think that there is a connection between how we show up at the, you can call it grassroots level, at the civil society level, the same way that we should show up in government and put pressure on our elected officials. I think sometimes we forget that we have power, consumer power, to be able to, connect with these tech companies.
Yeah.
Because after all, they do rely on the collective we to help inform not just their products, but what they will or will not do in these red lines. And so, I think that maybe that's the connection and the beginning of a potential solution is just like we should pull up in a collective manner on our members of Congress and our state legislatures and these presidents and these governors, or in whatever country you're in, these leaders. There's high time a conversation to be had on how do we roll up in intentional and strategic ways for our economic interest. Because, one thing that I know I've heard you talk about and I talk about is the fact that diversity, equity, inclusion is profitable. It's profitable. And that's not just making sure you had the one black person in your organization.
Right.
But when you take the time, if you find that it has a negative, disparate impact on black people, on brown people, on LGBTQ plus, on persons with disability, if you're the tech company that fixes it before it becomes a thing, that becomes potentially profitable for you.
Yeah, and especially if you're concerned about your bottom line, and at the end of the day, Black folks, we are the consumers and content creators on these social media platforms.
Facts.
We are the number one community that contributes to these platforms to make them what they are.
Facts.
Right? And so this has been a conversation in our community for a long time. Our consumer dollars have always kept the economy going, right? And so to large detriment to ourselves. We will spend money on things that we probably should not spend money on, and we keep the economy going. And it's the same sort of thing with social media, right?
Yeah.
If people are saying, "Hey, why am I seeing the same information from like the same 5-6 people?" And you start pushing back on that thing, then those tech companies are going to have to listen to the community that contributes the most content to these platforms. So there's power there. I absolutely agree with you. But this siloing thing, man, it's dangerous. And when you look at it through and this is another part of it. I look at it through the lens of security. I look at it through the lens of disinformation, misinformation. And when you look at it through that lens, you see it for the type of threat that it is, right? It goes beyond just, the algorithm is algorithming. You know what I mean? Like, it goes beyond that. No, you were being targeted in a very specific way. And that to me is wrong.
Yeah.
That to me is very wrong. So it's a conversation, that I feel like we've been having a conversation. Something substantive needs to be done.
Right.
You know, when you think about Brexit, when you think about 2016, when you think about 1/6, when you think about the hyper-nationalist moment that we're in that's being followed up by daily mass shootings, this is serious.
Right.
The threat level here is high.
Right.
And all of it connects. These aren't just one isolated situations. All of it connects, right?
Yeah.
And if you are existing in a particular silo on YouTube or Twitter or Instagram where you are being radicalized towards nationalism, that's a problem.
Yeah. My last question to you as we land this plane, we have made some strides in representation in the national security space of black folks, brown folks, black women, but there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. I want you to take the moment and like really connect with the other current and future Nolas, right? On what are the takeaways? Why should some of those, because I agree with you, this space is not for everybody, but those who it is for, I want you to connect with those people whose calling is in national security and in the international affairs space. Why should they be here?
Why should you be here? First and foremost, in an American context, we're all Americans. That label of citizenship isn't just for certain people, you know, and for that reason alone, you should care about the security of your country because that has everything to do with the security of your community and the security of your family, right? Secondly, we are in a moment where the world is literally shifting. We see it every single day. You know, I remember doing quite a bit of media during Balloon Gate with China, and people were genuinely scared, not understanding what was happening, right? And people wondering, when did China start bucking like this? Like what? You know, like all of a sudden you woke up one day and then China just like every 5 minutes they up to something.
It's
like
a dance battle.
Right.
We're throwing it down.
On? And so because of that shifting landscape, more voices, more ideas are needed to figure out how to deal with this, and not just in a strategic way regarding security defense, but culturally. And I think for people like us, we bring that cultural context to the field of security and policy, right? Because they go hand in hand. And one of the things I think that historically the U.S. has gotten wrong is ignoring the cultural piece. And I'll give you an example. During the lead up to Vietnam, President John F. Kennedy warned the U.S. about going into Vietnam. Why? Because he spent time there. And he said, listen, these people are going to fight. It doesn't matter how they do it, they're going to do it because they do not want to be recolonized, right? That's just how hungry they are for their freedom, right? And although the U.S. saw this as fighting for democracy and repelling communism, so we saw it through our kind of democratic lens of freedom, but that's not necessarily how the Vietnamese saw it, right? So then Vietnam turned into what Vietnam turned into. And then you have people later on, people like Robert McNamara saying, you know what, maybe war just isn't about defensive and offensive capabilities. You know, he didn't use the word culture, but it was a turning point where decision makers and stakeholders started to bring that culture and identity piece into the calculation. When you do not consider identity and culture into your calculation in a profound way, we have a lot of missteps. And I'll bring it to the current situation with Ukraine. Before Russia invaded Ukraine, and the U.S. had great intel about it, people like me were saying, leaning on, rational actor theory from realism, post-World War II constructs of the entire world, he's not going to invade. It's not in his state's best interest. Well, have you listened to what this man has been saying?
Oh, yeah.
He been telling y'all.
He said,
he said,
and I did it in Crimea in 2014. I'm a huff and puff and blow your house down, basically.
His identity is such that he's not leaving this world, this planet, until he tries to reunite the Russian Empire.
Right. Point
blank and period. He done said that. He's told us how he felt about Ukrainian people buku times, but we weren't listening. We were using our own constructs and tools to explain the world in a very succinct way. And that's where identity and that's where culture comes in. So that's why you need diverse voices at the table to kind of inject that subtle thing that someone else might be missing.
Yeah.
Right. So if you feel like, if you wake up in the morning and you think about the world, if you think about, wow, why did Russia pull out of the New START treaty? If you're that young Nola or that young Breon, then maybe, this might be for you. And because it matters for your own life. It matters for your community. It matters for your family. And one last thing that I'll say that's really important to me. There's this kind of new-ish concept called reputational security. Mm-hmm. It's something that I'm kind of interested in because it relates back to DEIA. And for those of us who've been doing this work, it's been called different things throughout time. I got into it when it was called social justice. Now it's called, DEIA. What matters here, it's more than just having that one kind of one person to be the representative for all folks. No, the substance piece is very important. Because if we go around the world talking about democracy, if we go around the world saying that diversity is our greatest strength and our greatest asset, and we're a country of immigrants, which I have a problem with that because not everybody decided to come here on their own will, but anyhow. When you're going around the world saying these things and you're not living up to it, then you're seen as a hypocrite, right? And so when we're talking about United States reputation, as we go around the world to be peace brokers, diplomats, trying to upsell democracy, we have to be trusted that we are doing what we're trying to tell other people to do. So if you are not really about DEIA and you're thinking it's just a fleeting moment, that's a mistake. Because our allies are watching us, and for sure our enemies are watching us. And what our enemies are thinking are, oh, they don't like black and brown people. They shoot them, they kill them, right? So if you want to go around the world and sit at the table and negotiate with people and they're thinking this about you, you're at a disadvantage.
Yep.
Right. So we have to keep our promises. We have to keep our word because DEIA, the security, the equity of folks of color, differently abled people, everybody, that makes us stronger at the negotiating table, point blank, period.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for being here. We're going to have you back to continue to talk on national security. And definitely wanted to clap it up to you for what you...
Thank you.
So we've had a dynamic discussion about national security. As you know, with the Policy Plug, you always have a homework assignment. We discussed the importance of checking your sources and disinformation, misinformation. And it can be started easy, right? Before you just retweet, check the article. Read the article. See if it makes sense. See if they have their sources rooted and grounded right, and then go ahead and press retweet if it acts out. But then also the most important part of this discussion was the fact that everyone has somewhere to be, a space for everybody. And for some of you in this national security space, this is your home. We need your voice. You belong here, you matter, and you help enhance our public policy. You help enhance our national security. So, yes, you that's wondering, is seriously me? Yes, you. Go ahead and get that degree. If you need be, go ahead and dust off that resume, pull up at the table, because the Policy Plug is for you, and this country has a space for you to be able to bring your brilliance to bear. This is the Policy Plug, the space where we humanize the people who influence policy and bring the policy to the people.